Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of great audience members gathered, and we've got a lot of great guests on the show. So, hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Welcome to our award-winning PRG Pulse post-election analysis. I'm Dee Martin, and along with colleague and great friend Scott Siegel, I co-chair the Policy Resolution Group. PRG is Bracewell's government relations and strategic communications practice. All right. As I mentioned, we've got a lot of great guests for you today who are going to share their insight and analysis alongside some of our brilliant PRG team members. Up for discussion, what happened last night and what's happening still this morning, what remains uncertain, what to expect in the lame duck, and what to expect in the next Congress. We're also going to talk about what to expect from the Biden-Harris administration in terms of flexing its regulatory and executive authorities given the election outcomes. And of course, what discussion would be complete without talking about what these results mean for the 2024 presidential election. All right, so that's a lot of ground to cover. Here's the deal. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll work to get them answered over the course of this discussion. If we don't get to them today, we're going to try to follow up with you separately. So I'm going to get on with it because we only have an hour. I'm going to start with Scott Siegel. Scott is widely recognized as a top lobbyist and advisor in the energy and environment space. And I have no doubt that many of you participating in today's webinar know Scott and know him well. Scott, if I had to sum up last night, I'd say red ripple, not red wave, except maybe in Florida, with a healthy dose of uncertainty. Do you think that's about right? And can you chat about that with our colleague and much in demand political analyst and lobbyist, Liam Donovan? Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Dee. Of course, it would be my honor to bring Liam into this. I do agree that expectations were not met, at least for many. Probably about one half of the Democratic doomsday scenario is actually what was realized last night, but we'll have to see what happens. Although it does seem like we're currently on a trajectory for Republicans to retake the House of Representatives. I'm going to bring Liam in a second, but I'm going to take my own prerogative for just 1 second and say, as somebody who does a lot of energy, environment, and natural resource issues, this midterm election was particularly interesting to me. And I do want people to understand that simply because we will have, or we are likely to have, divided government with one house at least being Republican controlled, does not mean that we should put all considerations of energy issues back on the shelf. We're going to have a whole separate discussion of this with great experts in the field that we're going to bring in for particular interviews. But I just want to point out that energy issues often have a regional component to them that is over and above the mere partisan politics. That there's a long and proud tradition of energy and environmental statutes being adopted by a divided government because of the relative balance in leverage that occurs between the entities, and that removing obstacles to the energy development that both parties tend to desire is something that could be the basis of bipartisan advancement. And of course, that includes things like permitting reform. I know that's a lot of specific stuff. We'll get to more details on that a little bit later in the broadcast. But I want to turn to my colleague, Liam Donovan. Opening question, Liam. What the heck happened last night? It does not seem to be the outcome that we thought we were going to get, as we started rolling down the hill. So what happened?
It's not the outcome that was expected. I think that's because the narrative talked itself into a bit of a frenzy. The bubble that we exist in the Washington media ecosystem, on social media, talked ourselves into this being this red wave that didn't necessarily manifest. This scenario that's playing out was always in the back of my mind. If you listen to our PRG Pulse episodes of the Lobby Shop, if you listen to me all over, this was always in the realm of possibility, even as the polls didn't particularly miss. I think people were putting a thumb on the scale after being burned for several straight cycles, expecting that there's just a hidden Republican vote that turns out. And as we just learned again, that doesn't happen when Donald Trump is not on the ballot. So I think it's a divided country delivering a divided Congress. It's unstoppable force versus immovable object and fighting to a stalemate. We're still not going to know what happens in the House or the Senate for a matter of days, certainly weeks, probably. We'll have to see how it plays out, but it's definitely not the night that Republicans were hoping for.
So, Liam, Republicans were designing or had a strategy in play, and part of that strategy was to put Joe Biden on the ballot everywhere. But part and parcel of that assumption was that Biden would be particularly unpopular at the moment of the election. And of course, as you and I have discussed, his favorability rating was at about 44%. And while that may sound low to a lot of people, it's not exactly a passing grade when you were in school. That was pretty high for Biden at the point at which election day occurred. So one wonders, in addition, as we discussed, for other presidencies, when we look at history, they've had very controversial legislative agendas. But, Biden's legislative agenda was sort of meat and potatoes: Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure reform, CHIPS Act. For semiconductors. These are not exactly the kind of red meat, controversial, social edged issues. So maybe having him on the ballot, if that was the attempt, really didn't pay off. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say one thing that I think they've known, that Joe Biden is not the kind of polarizing figure. You might have broad unpopularity, but you don't have the intensity of feeling that previous presidents, whether it was Trump or Obama or even Bush, might have offered. So I actually would say Biden was not central to most of the ads. It was mostly crime, immigration, inflation. Biden was one of the things they touched. But I think there was an appreciation among Republicans that just saying Joe Biden's name was not going to bring anybody down. Joe Biden was not an albatross. And as you said, his numbers were high enough that he didn't drag anyone down. He was high enough that people were able to sort of defy political gravity within a normal range. And I think that explains a lot of the outcomes.
Well, I tell you what, I'm watching the clock. And you've got better and more talented folks than I do. So why don't you introduce our next guest that you're going to interview?
Thanks, Scott. We're really pleased today to be joined by my friend Jonathan Martin. He is once and again of Politico, the hometown paper here. He's the politics bureau chief. He's senior political columnist, not reporter, senior political columnist. And he's also author of the best-selling book, This Shall Not Pass, with his longtime colleague, Alex Burns, available wherever fine books are sold. If you don't have a copy, I think you need to go out right now because it tees up perfectly this political moment we're in. So I'm excited to talk to him here, have a few minutes out of his day. I know he's on the road a lot right now. But Jonathan, as we take a step back here, I know there's still a lot we don't know, including the fate of the Senate majority. We have a pretty good sense of the House, but it's obvious that the red wave did not sleep across the country, even if it caught the part of Florida you're in right now. We're at best in sort of normal midterm territory. How do the recriminations play out among a Republican base and a Republican establishment that was primed for these big gains and a big victory lap?
Liam, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be with all of you on this glorious day after Election Day. I actually have to confess, I kind of like the day after Election Day more than Election Day itself, because we have numbers. We have, even though partial numbers, we can chew over what happened. Election Day itself, we have straws in the wind, and it's a lot of waiting around. So this is fine. I think what we now have on our hands is a long overdue reckoning in the Republican Party, one that was supposed to happen this time 2 years ago. Under Donald Trump's watch, his party lost the House, the White House, and the Senate in that order. And, but that's the track record of most presidents. They tend to sort of fade. And obviously that was not what Donald Trump wanted to do. And I think by contesting the results of the election, Donald Trump effectively delayed the reckoning that the party, I think, is bound to have now about are we being undermined by this larger-than-life figure who dominates our party? They couldn't have the conversation in 20 because Trump insisted upon making the conversation entirely about the results of the election and the lies that he made up about that. But he can't stop the conversation now because this was not supposed to happen in the eyes of both parties, frankly. Last night came as a real surprise to strategists at the top levels of the GOP and the Democratic Party. And I think that is going to cause a conversation among Republicans of not should we cut the cord, but how do we do it? Now, as we know, easier said than done. All the governors and senators and House members and donors and lobbyists in the world can say we got to move on. But if the party doesn't want to move on, by the party I mean the rank and file voters, it creates more of a challenge. And that gets to the same issue that has been looming on the horizon ever since Trump made clear he was going to run for president for a third time. And that is there going to be a divided primary field against him? Because if there is, he can certainly be the nominee again, even with the kind of reckoning that I'm talking about. That's the longer term. Let me just come back to the shorter term. The shorter term is I think it's hard for Trump not to go forward with his plans next week. If he does not announce, I think it's a sign of weakness, and we know Trump doesn't like weakness. But if he does go forward and he announces his candidacy, he immediately puts all the Republicans on the spot. And they come back for the lame duck session, and it's not a hypothetical. It's not a gotcha. It's a fair question. He's announced for president. Are you for him or against him? Senator Capito, Senator Tillis, Speaker McCarthy. And I think there's going to be a lot of that. The last thing I'll mention is this, is even if Nevada comes back for Masto and Kelly holds on in Arizona and Georgia, the only question is if Georgia is 50 or 51 for Democrats. I still think Trump's candidacy will really shape that race, because a Herschel Walker loss there will basically be sort of one more kick in the behind for Trump, and one more kick in the behind right after he announces his candidacy too. So the story, I think, in the short term, Liam, is still unfolding.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it this way, but as you mentioned, one of his tricks is every time 16, 18 even, and 20 is beating expectations, confounding the elites. And this is the first time that he's truly in his term, Republicans have really underperformed. And so that's definitely going to change how they're thinking about these things. You mentioned Speaker McCarthy, and I don't want to get too ahead of us because I don't think they've even called the House, but how does this outcome affect the early going of a nascent Republican majority in the House?
Well, I think, again, I come back to Trump. I mean, Trump will loom large, right? Because his amen corner, Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Matt Gaetzes of the world, I think are going to have a host of demand. And I think those demands are going to be in part shaped by one Donald J. Trump. Kevin McCarthy's going to be looking for speaker votes while Donald Trump is looking for primary endorsements at the same time. How does that work out in the House, right? Talk about cross currents, right? That's going to be fascinating. And taking Trump out of it, Liam, how big of a pound of flesh can the Freedom Caucus folks take from McCarthy? And I'm talking less about kind of the Trump acolytes and more just the traditional sort of Tom Massey crowd, the far right, Chip Roy's. What can they get out of Kevin on procedure and rules? And frankly, how much can they weaken the speakership? And that's going to be fascinating to me, is what Kevin has to trade in order to claim the speakership. Because I think obviously, geez, if they only have 223, 24 House Republicans, that's not a big margin to play with.
Putting Thomas Massey in the spot of a House version of Joe Manchin is a fascinating image for the next few months.
My new colleagues at Politico have Massey at the McCarthy party last night, invoking Manchin by name and saying, Incredible. I can't wait to be the Joe Manchin of the House,
Incredible. The Joe Manchin of the House. Okay, just rounding out the Republicans, because I know we don't have you for too much longer, but rounding out the Republican side, what does this do to McConnell? Does this bolster his standing? He was obviously right, but does being right help you in this moment?
You said McConnell, Liam?
I'm sorry if I didn't. Yes, I was thinking Mitch McConnell. How does this? He was obviously right in how he read this election and how he treated this election.
He's got two victory laps. He has the victory lap with regard to Rick Scott, and that conflict there, and obviously the larger victory lap with Donald Trump, right? McConnell was deeply concerned about the kind of candidates Trump was endorsing, and McConnell tried to get 4 governors, and they all said no to run for the Senate. And so here we are looking at a Senate that'll probably be 50-50 or 51-50 down. And so, yeah, I think McConnell will have a level of vindication, but let's not let McConnell off the hook here. The fact is, Mitch McConnell had a chance to drive Donald Trump out of electoral politics in January and February of 2021. And maybe he never could have gotten the 17 Senate Republicans to convict Trump, but he didn't even try. And he didn't try, Liam, in part. Why? Because he didn't want Trump to torpedo the 2022 midterms. And guess what?
Sweet irony.
Trump still torpedoed the 2022 midterms, which just shows with Donald Trump, you can delay and you can forestall and put off, but eventually you're going to have to confront the question yourself, because somebody else is not going to take care of the problem for you.
Okay, lightning round here, because there's so much to explore on the Republican side, but I don't want to let the Democratic side go, because there's a fascinating transitional moment here happening. I know you've covered it in your recent columns with Politico. What does this outcome, in brief, what does this outcome mean for the future of Joe Biden? What does it mean for the future of the Democratic leadership, as if we assume that Speaker Pelosi takes this as a victory and an opportunity to leave the stage?
Yeah, well, Liam, thank you for the plugs. I was at the Times for 10 years covering politics, and I just started this column, which I'm really excited about, at Politico. The first column that I did out of the gates was on a topic I've been really fascinated by, and I had some really inside kind of reporting on, which is the likely transition from Nancy Pelosi to Hakeem Jeffries as leader of the House Democrats. And in my mind, there were 2 remaining obstacles. One, the obvious one, Pelosi saying that she's done and stepping down. The other one, a little bit less known, and that's Jim Clyburn, the third-ranking Democrat, and whether or not he was going to accede to his fellow CBC member Hakeem Jeffries. And I found out that the 2 of them, Jeffries and Clyburn, had a clandestine meeting over the summer recess in the Capitol, a one-on-one in Clyburn's suite, just the 2 of them, during which Clyburn basically gave Jeffries his blessing. This is all a long way of saying, Liam, in reporting that column, I talked to a few dozen House Democrats. Look, they thought they would do worse in the House than they did, but the fact remains, House Democrats are eager to turn the page. They want a new slate of leaders, and I think Pelosi, in some ways, can actually leave now in a better place. I mean, totally plausible that Dems could take back the House in 2 years. She's not leaving after a 30-seat or a 40-seat landslide loss. And obviously she had a personal issue now to tend to. So I'm inclined to think that they're going to go forward with the procession that we all think, or the succession that we all think, which is Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar taking over on the top ranks of the House Democrats.
That's awesome. Well, Jonathan, we'll leave it there. We could talk to you all day, but really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your trip, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Leo, and I hope all of you will read my column in Politico going forward. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah. And of course, nobody was more interested in last night's results than President Biden, who I just mentioned, and the rest of his administration. To help us better understand the administration's perspective on last night's election, I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Yasmin Nelson. She's a PRG senior principal and former senior advisor to then Senator Kamala Harris. Over to you, Yasmin.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks so much. Listen, I think we have a real good treat for you guys today, and good friend Carissa Joy being here with us today. She is a former senior advisor to the president. She worked in the White House Office of Public Engagement, was a senior advisor for women's issues. She is an all-around amazing person, and so I'm really glad to have her with us today. She's now working as the director of vice president and director of government relations at Fox Corp. And so now I think we can kind of talk a little bit about the election day, right? It's over now. It's behind us. What are your thoughts on the election night?
Yes. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Yasmin, for having me. It's so good to see you. Yasmin and I go way back to our Senate days when she was then working for Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris. So, so good to see you. I think that, firstly, right off back, I think we led this call with saying that it wasn't essentially a red wave, as many people predicted, many pundits predicted. I know that we were closely monitoring some of the bellwether races, such as Slotkin in Michigan, Virginia Spanberger, and they won their races and they maintained their seats last night, which I think is a good indicator, essentially, of maybe where the national trend is heading. People were really focused on these races as kind of setting the tone of, okay, if they flip back to red, essentially both of these districts were won in 2018. They turned from pro-Trump to blue, that would have predicted the national trend of where we were going to head, especially going towards 2024. So it's good to see that some of those bellwether races it's good to see that some of those bellwether races ended up panning out a little bit differently than what was expected last night, to show that we're actually, even and even. We are seeing now in real time that there still is not a declarative answer on the Senate, and we are still seeing that Democrats are picking up seats in the House or winning, maintaining incumbents. So we'll see, I think, in a few hours, Yasmin, where things lie. I also want to just highlight some of the gubernatorial races that were, transformational last night across the country, such as, different candidates of different racial backgrounds, of gender backgrounds. I mean, we saw things that never happened before, such as Wes Moore in Maryland, even to Sarah Huckabee on the other side of the aisle. I mean, we saw, Democratic pickups and strongholds maintained in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which we know are all key states when it comes down to the general and obviously the general presidential in 2024. And then also, I think, we're going to continue to see that last night's results and the forthcoming results send a clear message to how both parties should prepare for 2024.
Right. I mean, last night really did, have some surprising things outside of just, Democrats being able to maintain a stronghold on some of these key races. There was also a big turnout for early voters. And so I know that given your experience working with this administration and the White House, working very closely or trying to encourage young voters, do you think that they were expecting the results, these results, or as in addition to the results, I think, in Pennsylvania, which showed a lot of early turnout?
Yeah, I actually do think, I think now that I'm on the outside, but, the tone when I left is that, the administration, I think from day one has been consistent in making sure that the echo chamber of President Biden's plan to return us to stability and normalcy in government has radiated from the national level, definitely to the grassroots level. I mean, we are seeing in real time that his legislative accomplishments are enthusing voters to get out to vote. Sure, there will always be criticism as to what policy pieces made it to the final bills that are getting passed and signed, but those wins are translating to voters, and we are seeing that they're still motivated post 2 years later to turn out to the polls. And we know that some of those legislative wins are the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. These are policies that voters are keeping in mind while heading to the poll, because President Biden has been proving to be effective in his legislative agenda that he set out day one.
I mean, perfectly said. One thing I do want to, kind of go back to was the point that you made about energizing voters, right? Reproductive justice was something that folks could say was on the ballot, right? Mm-hmm. The overturning of Roe v. Wade. Do you think that had an impact here in this election, in addition to his legislative victories?
Of course, I definitely think that. I mean, firstly, many exit polls show that top of mind issue for voters, regardless of party affiliation, was obviously inflation and the economy, right? Everyone at the end of the day cares about their kitchen table. But what we saw from voters yesterday, according to NBC, was that abortion access was ranked second as the second most critical issue to voters. I mean, we immediately saw that the executive branch and President Biden launched into action with a task force on reproductive health care access, essentially mobilizing a whole of government approach to essentially focus on this issue of reproductive health and access across the states. I mean, we've witnessed Vice President Harris make multiple trips to states, essentially engage with an intersectional coalition of elected officials, practitioners, and advocates of diverse backgrounds to essentially, galvanize and message that the administration was committed to reproductive health and access. So, I mean, we are seeing that they were working in real time to build a coalition about issues that mattered most to voters. We saw that every day and weekly with just their priorities of what was on their agenda. And I think we were seeing that some of those investments of the vice president being deployed, across these states is paying off. We are seeing that younger people are turning out. We are seeing that the advocates, the practitioners, the elected officials are essentially being those, I would say, spokespersons or surrogates on the ground, because they have seen in real time and felt the touch from the administration at the ground level.
So do you think that there was anything that the administration could have done to strengthen last night's election results?
I mean, there's always going to be, I think, criticism of was there inaction in the beginning? Was there too much action in the beginning? When did things start getting moving? I think the start of an administration, I would describe it as always like a startup, right? So there'll always be, I think, questions of what more could someone have done? And I think the answer is that we could always do something to strengthen the process and strengthen our outreach and our engagement. I think that something that has been improved is definitely the messaging and the coalition building. And I think we are seeing in real time, reaping the benefits of some of that infrastructure that was set up in 2020 is now coming to fruition, even with the voter turnout we're seeing across, Latino voters, diverse voters, millennial voters, Gen Z voters. We are seeing in real time, essentially, that the efforts of some of that early on engagement of that coalition building is now playing off. I mean, we can always do messaging better. We can always do communications better to reach, I think, different communities and different intersectional places. But at the end of the day, I think that, what we are seeing, as I'm looking at the TV screen right now, is that some of that coalition building was strengthened, especially in these last few months. And I think especially with his recent legislative wins, it has translated with who knows what he has done and why they're turning out to the polls.
So I have two kind of lightning round questions for you before we switch over to our next panelist. So we're going to have to make this quick, but moving forward, do you think that the Biden administration, with a split kind of power in the House and the Senate, we still don't know the results of the Senate, but it's looking like the House may have a small majority for Republicans. Do you think that how will the administration handle the domestic policy agenda moving forward?
Well, let me put it this way. I'll say, from my experiences there is that we know that Susan Rice, who is proudly there serving as the director of Domestic Policy Council, is moving things full steam ahead. I know that they are still engaging with, different coalitions and different voices and making sure that they're reaching everybody in between. I mean, again, economy is the top issue, from voters, regardless of a party affiliation. But we're seeing that there are some partisan divides when it comes to some of the domestic policy things that people care about. I mean, it was named earlier that, Republican voters were focused on the immigration, the violent crime. We're seeing that Democratic voters are focused on the future of democracy, healthcare and abortion, as we already stated. And so I do think that essentially that the domestic policy agenda will move forward as full steam ahead. I think that the results will definitely, sway essentially the prioritization of what bills and what legislation can get done, depending on if we lose the House or if we control it. So I do think that post-elections, there will always be that kind of jump to the finish line of kind of marking the halfway point of an administration.
Okay, so I have to get this question in. So I'm sorry. I feel like I'm getting the hook, but I have to get this question in. One of the major topics of this webinar is the future of energy policy. And the White House is still in the process of trying to stand up many of their energy-related, parts of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. How important are these IRA projects to the White House domestic policy agenda? And do you have any thought on how the role of environmental justice will play in the development of that agenda?
Excellent question. Well, one, we are currently, I think, in the throes of COP right now happening, and essentially we see that the administration is being deployed to essentially speak to these very key issues about where they are and where they stand on environmental justice, on climate, all of these issues. I mean, I think that, moving forward, the president has made very clear, especially with the staffing up, he hired John Podesta as a senior advisor for clean energy, innovation and implementation. He's also the chair of President Biden's National Climate Task Force. And essentially they unveiled that roadmap, this week at COP27. So I think you are seeing that essentially that the president is continuing his focus on climate. We heard very clear in the campaign that it is a top coalition that we don't want to essentially let slip through the cracks or that we ignore. And so I just think even this week reaffirms already some of the previous actions that the president has taken to essentially meet the climate community, the energy community where they are. I know that he had issued an executive order on Earth Day last year, recognizing the importance of forests and other nature-based solutions to tackle climate crisis. So there's so many things. We have a racial equity CSR located at the White House focused on environmental justice. She's awesome. And so some of these things I think, related to the personnel, the staffing, and even the rollouts of these certain roadmaps that they're doing this week, on the margins of COP are a clear indicator that this president, this administration is committed to focusing on climate justice. And those are things that matter the most.
Excellently said. So I wanna now switch. Thank you so much for coming on this webinar today, Carissa. We really appreciate you sharing your insight. Now that we have the Biden administration's take on last night, it's time to focus on the next Congress and what we can expect for our energy and environmental policy. To help guide us through that discussion, I'm happy to toss it back to my friend Scott.
Thanks so much, Yasmin. And thank you, Carissa. That was an excellent discussion of where the administration is. And I would just recommend everybody, if you haven't had a chance to look at the administration's roadmap that was released at COP27, it is worth taking a look at if you're curious at all about how the first day promise of keeping us on a glide path toward a 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 levels is proceeding. You can really see it in real time in what the administration released. I would note a couple of different things. They're removing obstacles to the clean energy revolution and to sufficient production with conventional sources of energy seem to be areas which are potentially areas of common ground, but also there will be a very congested administration priority as it relates to regulatory initiatives, particularly coming out of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Everything from smog and soot to carbon pollution standards for electric power generation to methane controls to wastewater standards and the like. And on the motor vehicle side of things, the administration's already served notice of what they intend to do to advance tailpipe standards, pollution standards from automobiles and light duty trucks. Even though that has encountered what I might call a hail of legal opposition as it relates to what the underlying statutes will allow them to do. Well, a lot of activity going on here, and I've got a great guest to bring on board here. My good friend, Abby Hopper, who is president and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association, which is the national trade association for the American solar industry. I first met Abby when she was an energy advisor to then Governor Martin O'Malley in the state of Maryland. And then, of course, she went from there to directing the Department of Interior's BOEM, or Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So talk about a broad, sweeping approach to energy. My friend Abby Hopper has that. Abby, thank you so much for joining us. I hope, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly. That's great. Well, let's jump right on in. I mean, Mike, this basically is addressed to you and in your capacity at SEIA. What you've seen what happened last night. It looks like the House of Representatives is probably trending toward Republican leadership. It looks like the Senate may not be. Hard to say. We may have a divided Senate and on top of divided government. What do you see first as the future for implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act? Because obviously there's a lot of good stuff in there, not just for solar, but for wind and other forms of renewables. What do you think that's going to encounter tough sledding in the House? What's your judgment on that?
Well, first of all, Scott, thank you for inviting me. It's good to see you. I stayed up way too late, probably like most of us. So I have my coffee right here, my favorite coffee. So so much of what has to happen in the implementation phase obviously does not necessarily involve the Congress. And so The speaker who was here immediately prior to me, I caught the end of her comments, and if I was in the Biden administration right now, it would, and I'm sure this is exactly what's happening, head down, full force ahead to get the regulations out to implement the IRA. Right, the best thing that we can do as a clean energy space to ensure the continuation of the IRA is to have projects on the ground, jobs being created, tax revenue happening, local politicians seeing evidence of growth in their local communities, in their states, in their jurisdictions, right? And so we can't do that until we know what the rules of the road are. And so we need this administration to do that. I'm more focused on sort of the 2 years we have left. We know we have left to implement. What I am particularly concerned about, and prior in my last job, right, where I was the head of BOEM, and I'm very familiar with what an oversight committee hearing feels like. We have been talking a lot and preparing a lot about ensuring that the processes that we go through and sort of the way the monies and tax credits and eligibility is defined and applied are transparent and fair and sort of in line with the intent of the Congress, so that when there are oversight committee hearings, not if, the solar industry, the storage industry, the clean energy industry will be managing those in an appropriate way. I think that's will be a focus of all of ours. In the coming years. Obviously, there's lots of additional legislative efforts we would like to have take place. Many of them are, I think, more bipartisan, things around transmission, right? It doesn't really matter where your electrons come from. We all agree there's consensus that transmission is important. Similarly with domestic manufacturing, if there are some sort of fixes to make to the IRA, I mean, who's against domestic manufacturing? So I am hopeful that we'll be able to find some common ground despite where the House and the Senate fall. But as I said, implementation.
Right. No, that makes total sense. In fact, as you were speaking, I'm reminded that we've had major debates regarding permitting reform, and as that relates to transmission and other questions, we've had major debates on the development of access to critical minerals, which are and rare earth elements, which are very important for the solar industry, and we've had major questions regarding incentives for clean energy manufacturing, and it seems like all of those things could be the basis for bipartisan consideration, just as you said, and are so important for the future development plans for solar. I mean, no pun intended. I think your future's pretty bright.
I would concur with you. As I sit here in the sunshine looking at the White House, it feels pretty bright.
That's good. I'm glad to hear it. Another quick question for you. With respect to oversight, now we all remember, I hate to even mention the word, and you'll probably know what word I'm about to mention.
Oh, I know exactly what you're about to say.
Yeah. So years and years ago, we at a more nascent program for grant making authority and loan guarantees out of the Department of Energy, Republicans had a bit of a field day. When a company called Solyndra, and probably a lot of our listeners have heard of it, collapsed. Now, I've always thought that when the government acts with industry, it often does so on more speculative technology. So the idea that occasionally one of them would fail is not too terribly off the wall. But the specter of Solyndra as an oversight issue, do you think I'm going to lead the witness here, but do you think your industry is a much more mature industry at this point that can avoid things like that? Or where are we in time and space if they try and nitpick through individual loan guarantees or grants?
Right. Yes, our industry is much more mature, and the technology is more mature. The financing structures are more mature. The sort of broad base of customer support and business demand for our projects is greater. However, that doesn't entirely eradicate the risk, right? And so I think transparent, objective criteria for grant making, for eligibility requirements. Probably everyone on this call spent the greater part of the last month writing comments to the Department of Treasury around what are the eligibility requirements, what is domestic content, what counts, what doesn't count, right? What is prevailing wage? When does it, how do you, if you're whatever, if apprenticeship, if you can't find apprentice, what do you do? And so I think that the administration has a big role to play in making sure that the rules are super clear so that there's not a lot of areas for interpretation, right? So that we don't say, well, there's not an oversight hearing where it's like, well, company X, they skated inside the rules because they weren't clear. Like I am a lawyer by training, as I know you are, and companies want certainty, right? So our companies want certainty. They are happy to abide by the rules once they know what they are, and they can't do that yet. So obviously there's risk, but we're doing that. I will say on the other, Cylinder was obviously a manufacturing facility. Lots of consumers, lots of individual homeowners that are going to benefit as well from the IRA. And so at SEIA, we always have had a very robust consumer protection program. We work with the attorney generals. We work with the Better Business Bureau to make sure that customers know what they're getting into, right? What are they signing up for? What kind of savings are they likely to have? But we are... how should I say this? We're putting that on steroids right now, right? We want to make sure that as money and opportunity is flowing, that consumers are going in with eyes wide open, right? These are great opportunities for homeowners to make choices about their energy use, but they need to be informed choices. And so that's another area in which I think some proactive decision making and proactive policy and proactive sort of ways of operation of our companies will help mitigate risk on the other side.
Well, speaking of playing by the rules, I swore to your staff that I would I would let you go at T-minus 2 minutes ago. So I want to thank you for joining us. I think your comments were right, spot on, and prescient. I think we can both agree that the chances that the Congress that emerges from this midterm will, quote, repeal or otherwise do serious damage to IRA seems to be diminished given the outcome. And so, I think the future looks pretty good for solar.
Yeah, and let's go build, right? And make believers out of those that are perhaps skeptics at the moment. This is real infrastructure. Let's go make it happen. And go Caps. Where I'll be tonight.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Good to see you, Scott.
Good to see you too, Abby. Okay. Bye. Now, as many of you know who work with us or have engaged with us in the past, we have a pretty broad, sweeping approach to energy, from renewables like Abby's members to traditional sources of energy like the oil and gas industry. And we've got a real treat in our next guest, my good friend Frank Macchiarola, who is in charge of policy and many other things at the American Petroleum Institute, who's joining us today. And what some of you may not know about Frank is he also was the chief of staff of the Senate Energy Committee and the chief of staff of the Senate Help Committee, and did both of those jobs at a very, very young age, because he's still a young man. Before some time of his ill-spent youth with us at Bracewell, actually. So as you are proudly showing some of your swag from your Bracewell years, thank you for that advertisement. I appreciate it. Frank Macchiarola, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
Scott, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So leading into the election, this is going to come as a terrible surprise to you. There was some controversy about the price of gasoline, I seem to recall reading about, and therefore fuels policy was somewhat at the forefront of at least a lot of election talking points, particularly on the Republican side. Gas prices were widely discussed. Actually, I'm sorry, on both sides, because the blameworthiness aimed at the oil and gas industry was a Democratic talking point, and the fact of public policy not being able to address gas prices was a Republican talking point. What kind of a role do you think that actually played in the election? Do you think it inflicted any damage on the industry? And what type of policy initiatives do you think flow from that? That's a lot of wide open stuff, but I turn it to you Frank, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think it's too soon to tell the impact on that it had on the election. I think the election's still playing out to some extent as votes are being counted. But it was certainly an issue leading up to the election and something that the administration focused on to a much greater degree than past administrations had. A lot of stories about Ron Klain focusing on the day-to-day price of gasoline and responding to it. But if a lot of the White House and administration's response to it was simply rhetoric, either trying to shift blame or trying to explain, take credit for a reduction in the price of gasoline. But there weren't a lot of policy measures that they took. In fact, the only real substantive action that they took was to draw down the Strategic Petroleum Reserve from about 615,000 in last October, when this started becoming an issue, to a year later around 400,000. And during that period of time, the average price of gasoline actually rose by 40 cents. So I don't know that it was much of a factor, and I don't know that voters really thought that the administration had taken steps to address gas prices.
Yeah, that makes enormous sense to me. The administration at the very end, right before the election, started to raise the specter of windfall profits taxes as kind of a frame for discussing, profit taking or buybacks and other practices within the oil and gas industry. Now that they've gone through the midterm and the impact of the midterm, the impact of gas prices, at least on these discrete Democratic races and on the president's own approval rating, seems to have been diminished somewhat, or perhaps it had been overstated previously. I wonder, no pun intended, if this discussion of things like windfall profits taxes or bans on energy exports from gasoline to crude petroleum have run out of gas. In other words, if those really are not going concerns anymore, but were the type of thing one hears prior to an election. And given the result they got in the election, maybe the chances that those types of policies would produce a significant unintended adverse consequence might be enough to keep them from actually pursuing those as matters of policy, not to mention the fact they don't have the votes. So what do you think about that? Are we going to hear more about windfall profits taxes or export bans? Or do we think that the midterm election has kind of taken the air out of the tires?
Well, first, stay tuned for an even numbered year. That's when this seems to get more attention. But also, I'd say the administration was playing a bit of defense for what they did in the beginning of their term. They did put a pause on oil and gas leasing on federal lands, unprecedented in either party. They did cancel pipeline projects. They did propose tax increases in their budget and then actually pass tax increases. And so they had a lot of explaining to do for, a swift transition from oil and gas in year one to, claiming that they wanted to see more production and supply in year two. So, I think there may be more of that depending on what happens with prices. I don't see the administration, though, changing its policies. They didn't change their policies during the high point of prices, and they certainly won't change their policies if prices recede. But I would say, who knows how the both chambers are going to end up when all the votes are counted. But assuming we have divided government, we have seen energy legislation in past divided governments. We saw the crude oil export ban lifted in a Republican Congress and an Obama administration. We saw the Energy Independence and Security Act during the Bush administration and a Democratic Congress. So it doesn't mean that Congress stops working and the administration stops working, though, we obviously are preparing for a greater regulatory approach from the administration. And so that'll be an area where we focus. But I think just stepping back and generally looking at the election, Scott, I think a lot of people's reactions today have to do with their expectations going in. And so we've sort of become addicted to wave elections and changes in majority. But there was a 40-year period where Democrats held the majority in the House. And now we've had since 94, 5 different shifts if the majority flips. And 4 of them in the last 16 years. And so we're continuing to see government turnover. We obviously have a very divided electorate. But one of the things that jumps out to me from this election that people have not really focused on much is in the Senate and governor's races. There were 28 incumbent governors on the ballot. They're still counting in Nevada, but all of the others have won. And there were 28 incumbent senators on the ballot, and they're all still counting. None of them have been knocked off yet. And I think there's only 4 left. So the power of incumbency again, I guess the takeaway is things are great. I don't know. It's a very confusing takeaway. It was, I think most people will say this was a missed opportunity for Republicans going into the election. Get the Gallup question on which party is most likely to fix the issue most important to me, a general issue. You can pick the issue that's most important to you. Republicans had an 11-point lead. Their Gallup asked it in every election, so it was the biggest lead they've had since the Second World War. And I don't think anyone's going to say this reflects the type of wave that number would presume. So, for us, we're going to remain focused on the things that are important to the oil and gas industry. We're going to remain focused on greater access to development of oil and natural gas in the U.S. Infrastructure. You heard Abby talk a bit about permitting reform. Well, infrastructure is important for every source of energy, and so we would agree that needs to be a priority in the next Congress and for this administration. And then we're going to continue to talk about the importance of exports. Crude oil exports, refined product exports, and LNG exports have been a win for this country economically, environmentally, and for our energy security. We've studied the issue. We've studied all 3 of those issues here at API in the last year, and the studies and the data show that those policies have benefited the United States, both from an economic standpoint and an energy security standpoint. So we're going to continue to make that case. And then on LNG exports, we think that the benefits that natural gas has had in this country with respect to reducing emissions can be shared with other countries to meet their goals of reducing emissions. And we think that's a win for the United States as well in creating jobs and strengthening our energy security. And so we're going to really promote LNG exports in the coming year. And we think that's an issue that can have bipartisan support.
Right. It's interesting to hear you and Abby both talk about, the sort of permitting obstacles and the need to address obstacles as it relates, I'll just say, to linear infrastructure. I mean, in her case, transmission, in your case, pipeline networks and the like. So I do think there's area for common ground. In fact, permitting reform, well, it might even be a lame duck issue. I don't want to prejudge, but I'm thinking if not, certainly an early priority of the next impaneled Congress.
Permitting reform is essential for us. We have the 2nd largest natural gas basin in the world, sitting right next to New England, which needs natural gas and has high natural gas prices. We've had 4 major projects either canceled or delayed that could add an additional 4.6 BCF of natural gas per day. That's why Joe Manchin is talking so much about the Mountain Valley Pipeline. It's just so critical to getting that production in Appalachia up. and to getting the natural gas to the consumer that desperately needs it. I don't understand why we haven't done it.
Exit question for you.
Yeah.
Is it possible to pass that during the lame duck, given the results that we saw in the midterm?
Anything's possible, Scott. It's very difficult, though. I mean, lame duck sessions certainly depends on both chambers and where the majority shakes out. But when you have a change in majority control, it's very hard to get much done in a lame duck session because obviously the party coming into power has different ideas and different priorities.
Right. Okay. This was awesome as usual. Conversation with you is a tutorial on energy politics, and that's what we're hoping to achieve.
Thanks.
So thanks very much, Frank.
Thank you.
Now, let me change the topic a little bit to the question of oversight. I think you heard both. We touched on these issues both with Frank and with Abby, and with Carissa. Frankly, everybody mentioned that the advent of a Republican House is likely to bring more oversight, particularly in the direction of some of these energy policies, given the massive implementation that's going on of the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Joe Brazauskas, who is a colleague of ours here at Bracewell in the Policy Resolution Group, but previously was a senior counsel on the Oversight Committee, served in other capacities on the House Oversight Committee on the Republican side. So his thoughts on this will be very interesting. He also had positions at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and on the House Science Committee as well, but most recently as a senior counsel on the Oversight and the Oversight and Government Reform, I think is the full title of it, committee. All right, Joe, welcome. Well, everybody talks about oversight. I don't think not everybody knows what it is. So can you start off by just telling us what is congressional oversight?
Sure. And thank you very much, Scott. So congressional oversight is a mechanism undertaken primarily by congressional committees to review, monitor, and supervise the actions of the federal government. And in this case, Republicans who we are likely to be in control of the House and therefore the committee leadership of the House committees will focus its oversight on the Biden administration's policies and regulations. So more specifically, congressional committees are charged with looking at what has the administration been authorized by Congress to implement. So functionally, this means Republicans will hold adversarial congressional hearings with senior administration officials. They'll be writing letters requesting documents and other information from federal agencies, and they'll be obtaining regular briefings from senior federal agency officials. And what is important about this is that oversight authority is backed by the ability of the committee chairs to authorize subpoenas to compel testimony and documents from federal agencies. And of course, all congressional committees in the House have dedicated oversight subcommittees with chairs and staff who are charged with conducting investigations within the committee's jurisdictional purview.
All right. Well, that is the definition, but it sounds like it's a lot of the government. The congressional overseers talking to the executive branch agencies that they oversee. But Congress, and while Congress does have an awful lot of interest in that, how do private companies potentially run afoul or get caught up in congressional oversight? How does that work?
Right. And that's a great question. So, of course, the federal government, I would say, is the primary target of congressional oversight. But of course, Congress's oversight authority extends beyond the federal government. So committees can and do regularly request information from private companies and citizens in the course of oversight and investigation efforts. And of course, I would be remiss to not note that the subpoena authority of Congress Congress extends also to private companies and individuals. So Congress can compel testimony and documents from individual citizens and companies, trade associations, other groups. So
I mean, Abby and I talked about Solyndra, and Solyndra was a private company that obviously had to call for account years ago in front of oversight.
Exactly, and that's 100% right, and also kind of what Abby touched on, and what's important is that companies or individuals who sort of find themselves at this nexus of private industry and the federal government are the ones who are most likely to be subject to this congressional scrutiny. So I'm kind of thinking that the easiest way to think about this is our instances where there's sort of a financial agreement between the government and a company or an individual. So if that's a loan guarantee or a grant or a contract, congressional oversight tends to follow the money. So for example, if U.S. taxpayer money is funding or could fund a project or business, Congress is likely to scrutinize how that money is spent and ask, is this a good investment for the American taxpayers' money? And of course, maybe someone's asking themselves, a committee's already asked the federal agency for that information. Well, these investigations tend to overlap. So there's a strong probability that even if Congress has already asked a federal agency for this information and asked them hard questions, the letters or a subpoena or a witness invite are coming for the company that's involved as well. And then I would be sort of remiss to not note that Republicans have laid a few markers down outside of sort of the traditional congressional nexus. I would say that private entities that have sort of even a no express connection with the administration, but that Republicans may feel are sort of furthering the policies of the administration in some ways. So I'm thinking like social media and tech companies that have what Republicans perceive to be working closely with the government or have, issues with privacy for American citizens. This is in regard. Yes, Scott.
We're over the mark.
Okay.
But I still have to ask you another question. That question is this. This question is this. As I said at the outset, while Joe has absolutely essential oversight credentials, he is currently my colleague here at Bracewell. And so I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, suppose you were subject to oversight, what should the reasonably prudent company or private interest do to handle potential oversight inquiries?
Right. So I kind of think about this in two ways. So there's the first is the defensive posture. So that's if you feel you could be scrutinized by Congress for oversight purposes. So companies really need to be conducting the due diligence to sort of determine that nexus I talked about with the federal government. Work to determine where that exposure is, and then ultimately develop a strategy for responding to that potential oversight. And that's also kind of a threefold process. That's looking at it from the legal, political, and public relations angle, because these issues are really fought in those three arenas. And then just the second point that I'll throw out there is that companies also really need to examine the opportunities to leverage congressional oversight. And they should be thinking about how is shining a light on regulations or policies in the Biden administration benefit the strategies and goals of their business model or their industry. So that's kind of the two ways that I like to think about it.
Well, Joe, the answer is comprehensive, and I think this brings us to the end of our webinar. We've heard from a lot of different folks, a lot of folks in industry, folks that have some solid governmental experience. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in and being a part of this. If I have any parting words on all this, I guess what I would say to you is, first, that we are going to have a series of written materials that constitutes deeper dives in issue areas that we'll have out by the end of this week. And so if you've signed up for this webinar, you will be getting those materials. If you have others that you think might want those materials, please feel free to forward them. But better yet, let us know if there are other individuals that you think might want it, and we'll certainly do it. All materials eventually will be posted on policyresolutiongroup.com, which is our platform just for the Policy Resolution Group, the government relations and strategic communications aspect of Bracewell. And my last word is that, part of what was interesting about this midterm election is how old-fashioned it seemed in a lot of different ways. I mean, different races had their sort of different elements to them. There was not a wave one way and a wave another way. And in fact, we had a return to a little bit of normalcy. And I want to just give you one finger in the air that's indicative of that. I noted before we sat down here that Mehmet Oz picked up the phone and called John Fetterman and conceded. And I also noted that last night, in a very hard-fought race, Stephanie Abrams picked up the phone and called her longtime nemesis, Governor Kemp, in Georgia, and conceded. And I just want to remind everybody, that's the way this is supposed to work. All right. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And we appreciate it and look forward to those materials. And we'll see you again in 2 years. Bye-bye.